The text came at 11,047 on a Tuesday night. "Hey, I think it's better if you don't come to the rehearsal dinner or the wedding. It's just gonna be easier for everyone." I stood in my kitchen holding my phone, rereading that sentence 4 times. The refrigerator hummed. The faucet dripped. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked twice and went quiet. Easier for everyone. I had just spent $73,000 on my brother's wedding. I want to tell you that I screamed or cried or called someone immediately, but I didn't. I just set my phone face down on the counter, poured myself a glass of water, and stood there in the dark for a long time. Because some betrayals are so complete, so perfectly shaped, that your brain refuses to process them all at once. It lets them in slowly, like cold water rising. That was a Wednesday. By Friday, I had canceled everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning, because you need to understand who I was before that text message. You need to understand how someone ends up writing a $73,000 check for someone else's wedding in the first place. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, the middle child of 3. My older brother was 7 years ahead of me, and my younger sister was 4 years behind. My brother. I'll call him my brother throughout this, because that's what he was to me, or what I thought he was, had always been the one who needed rescuing. Not in a dramatic way. In the quiet, persistent way of someone who simply expects the floor to hold them up without ever checking if it's solid. He borrowed money from our parents constantly growing up. Nothing enormous, just a steady trickle. $20 here, $100 there. Car repairs, rent gaps, bar tabs that got out of hand. My parents never said no. He was the firstborn, and I think they decided somewhere along the way that their job was to protect him from consequences. That belief became the foundation of our entire family's architecture. I was different. I'd always been the responsible one. Not because anyone asked me to be, but because I watched what happened when you weren't. And I decided early that I wanted no part of it. I paid my own way through college, worked 2 jobs, graduated with a finance degree, and got a job at an accounting firm in Cincinnati at 24. By the time I was 28, I was making good money. Not extravagant money, but solid, stable. I can breathe money. My brother, at 35, was still struggling. He'd had a series of jobs that never quite stuck. Sales positions, a brief attempt at personal training, 2 years managing a bar that eventually closed. He wasn't lazy exactly. He just had a remarkable talent for landing just short of where he needed to be. And whenever he landed short, someone in the family reached out a hand. Usually, by then, that someone was me. I want to be clear about something. I helped him because I wanted to. Or at least, I told myself I did. When he needed $1,200 for a security deposit on his apartment in 2019, I sent it without hesitation. When his car needed a transmission replacement and the bill was $2,800, I covered it. When he called at midnight because he'd overdrafted and had a bill due the next morning, I transferred the money before I even got out of bed. Each time felt like an act of love. Each time, he thanked me warmly, and I felt like a good sister, and that feeling was worth something to me. I won't pretend it wasn't. What I didn't see, what I refused to see for a long time, was that my willingness to catch him had quietly become a structural feature of our family. I wasn't helping occasionally. I had become the safety net, and no one ever asked me if I wanted that job. It was simply assigned. He met his fiancée, I'll call her my future sister-in-law, at a friend's birthday party in the spring of 2 years ago. She was 32, worked in marketing, and was, from the first time I met her, someone who knew exactly what she wanted and moved toward it with absolute precision. In some ways, I admired that. She was direct, confident, clear. In other ways, I should have paid more attention to what she wanted and where she intended to get it from. They got engaged 8 months later. My brother called me the morning after he proposed. He was ecstatic, stumbling over his words, laughing at nothing. I was genuinely happy for him. He'd had a hard run of years, and he seemed, in that moment, like someone who had finally found solid ground. The wedding conversation started about 2 weeks after the engagement. My mother called me on a Sunday afternoon. She led with small talk for about 4 minutes, weather, a cousin's new baby, a recipe she'd tried, and then she said, "We've been talking about the wedding." I asked her what she meant. She said my brother and his fiancée had been looking at venues and had found something they really loved in Nashville. A restored barn property outside the city, with ceremony and reception space, catering, and a bridal suite. It could accommodate 180 guests. It was beautiful, she said. The kind of wedding his fiancée had always dreamed of. I asked how much. My mother paused. The venue alone is around $42,000. And then there's catering, flowers, photography, music. I asked how much total. Another pause. They're estimating around $70,000 to $75,000. I remember the silence that followed. I remember looking out my apartment window at the street below, watching a woman walk a golden retriever, thinking about how normal everything looked outside. I asked where they expected that money to come from. My mother said, "Well, your father and I can put in about $8,000, and we were hoping." She stopped. Then she said, "You've always been so good with money, sweetheart, and you know your brother doesn't have." I stopped her there. I said I needed to think about it. I should have said no. I want to tell you clearly, sitting here now, that I should have said no in that phone call on that Sunday afternoon before any of this started. But I didn't. And I have spent a lot of time since then trying to understand why. Part of it was guilt. Not guilt that I'd done anything wrong, but guilt that I had money and he didn't. And in my family, that gap had always been treated as something I was quietly responsible for closing. Part of it was love. Genuine, uncomplicated love from my brother, who had always been, beneath his chaos, someone I cared about deeply. And part of it, the part I'm least proud of, was that I wanted to be the person who made beautiful things happen. I wanted to be the one who gave him the wedding he couldn't give himself. I called my brother 2 days later. He answered immediately, and I could tell from the half-second delay before he spoke that he already knew why I was calling. I told him I would cover the wedding, up to $75,000. He cried. My brother, who I had never seen cry in my adult life, actually cried. He told me I was the best person he knew. He said he would never forget it. He said someday he would find a way to pay it back. I told him it was a gift, not a loan. I meant it. The planning started immediately. His fiancée had clearly been preparing for this moment, because within 48 hours, she had a spreadsheet, a vendor list, and a preliminary timeline. She was efficient, I'll give her that. She looped me into an email chain for venue correspondence because I was the one putting down the deposits. And for the first few months, that's how I was involved, as the financial infrastructure. I signed the venue contract. I put my name on the catering agreement. I paid the deposits to the florist, the photographer, the band. Everything ran through me because everything was being paid by me. But I wasn't part of the wedding conversation. Not really. I wasn't consulted on the color palette or the menu or the guest list. I wasn't asked for input on the ceremony structure or the reception layout. My future sister-in-law had a very specific vision, and she executed it with military focus, and my role was to make that vision financially possible. I told myself this was fine. It was their wedding, not mine. It wasn't my place to have opinions about centerpieces. The guest list was finalized about 4 months before the wedding. I was not shown it. I assumed I was on it. Obviously, because I was the bride's soon-to-be sister-in-law and the person funding the entire event. I didn't think to ask. I should have asked. The first sign that something was wrong came about 6 weeks before the wedding. My future sister-in-law and I had a phone call to go over a final payment schedule. The balance on the catering was due, and there were a few remaining vendor invoices. At the end of the call, she said something that I filed away without fully examining at the time. She said, "We really just want the day to feel calm, low-key energy, just close family and our core friends." I said that sounded lovely. She said, "Right. People who just, blend in. Don't make it about anything other than us." I said I understood. I didn't understand. Or rather, I understood the words, but I didn't understand what they were pointing at. 3 weeks before the wedding, my brother called me on a Wednesday evening. He started with about 10 minutes of ordinary conversation. Work, the weather, something funny that had happened with a friend of his. Then he went quiet for a moment, and I knew that quiet. I had grown up with that quiet. It was the quiet that came before he needed something. He said, "So, I wanted to talk to you about the wedding." I said, "Okay." He said, "You know how much we love you. You know how much this has meant to us, everything you've done." I said, "Okay." He said, "She's worried about the dynamic. She feels like," and I'm not saying I agree, I'm just telling you what she said, "she feels like you might unintentionally, obviously, kind of take up a lot of space because of everything you've done, and she wants the day to feel like it belongs to her." I asked him what he was saying. He said, "We think it might be better if you weren't at the wedding. Just the ceremony and reception. We'd love to have you at something smaller, maybe a dinner before, or," I said, "Are you telling me not to come to the wedding?" He was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, "She just thinks it'll be cleaner." I asked him if he agreed with her. Another long pause. Then, "I think I have to support my wife." She wasn't his wife yet. I thought that, but I didn't say it. Instead, I said I needed some time to think. He said he understood. He sounded relieved, which told me everything about how he'd been carrying that conversation for weeks before he made the call. I hung up and sat on my couch without moving for a long time. I wasn't crying. I was doing something quieter than crying. I was understanding. I understood that I'd spent $73,000, final tally, once all invoices were paid, on a wedding I was not invited to. I understood that my brother had known this conversation was coming for weeks and had said nothing while I continued writing checks. I understood that his fiancée had looked at me the entire time as a funding mechanism and had never, not once, considered me a person whose presence at the event she was actually interested in. I understood that I had done this to myself, not by giving the money, that part I could live with, but by giving the money without ever asking what I was giving it for and to whom and on what terms. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed and I thought very clearly, more clearly than I'd thought about anything in a long time. By 4 a.m., I had made a decision. The next morning I called my bank. I called the venue. I called the caterer. I called the florist, the photographer, the band. I called every single vendor whose contract had my name on it. Every single one of them. I told the venue that due to a change in circumstances, I needed to initiate a cancellation review per the terms of the contract, because I was the contract holder, because my name was the one on every dotted line. I had standing to make that call. The venue's cancellation policy at 3 weeks out allowed for a partial refund, less the non-refundable deposit. That deposit was significant. But the remaining payments, I could stop. The caterer had a similar structure. So did the florist. The photographer was fully refundable at 3 weeks. The band was not, but I made the call anyway. By noon, I had sent one message to my brother. I've contacted all vendors as the primary contract holder. I've initiated cancellations and holds on all remaining accounts. If you'd like to move forward with the wedding, you'll need to transfer all contracts to new names and arrange your own financing. I wish you well. I put my phone on silent and went for a long walk. I don't have to tell you what happened next because you can probably imagine it. The calls started within the hour. My brother, his fiancée, my mother, my father, an aunt I hadn't spoken to in 4 years. The texts came in waves, first confused, then panicked, then angry, then something that was trying to sound like reason. My mother left a voicemail that lasted 11 minutes. She said I was being vindictive. She said I was punishing my brother for something his fiancée had done. She said I was going to destroy the family. She said she raised me better than this. My father sent a single text, "Call me. This has gone too far." His fiancée said nothing for the first several hours. Then she sent a message that I read once and set down. She said that she had never meant to exclude me, that it had been a miscommunication, that she'd be happy to revisit the seating arrangements if I would please reinstate the vendor contracts. My brother called 8 times in one afternoon. When I finally picked up on the 9th call, he sounded nothing like the man who had cried when I said I'd pay for his wedding. He sounded exhausted and thin. He said, "You're really going to do this?" I said, "You're really going to do this?" I said, "You really did that." He said, "What do you want from me? An apology?" "Fine, I'm sorry. I handled it wrong, but there's a wedding in 3 weeks with 188 guests and vendors who are going to walk if we don't sort this out." I said, "That sounds like your problem." He was quiet. I said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly. When you called me and told me not to come, did any part of you, any part at all, think about the fact that my name was on every contract?" The pause lasted long enough that I had my answer before he spoke. He said, "I thought you wouldn't." I said, "You thought I wouldn't do anything. You thought I'd cry and feel guilty and eventually just accept it because that's what I've always done." He didn't argue with that. He couldn't. I told him I loved him. I meant it even then. I told him that I hoped they found a way to have the wedding they wanted, and I meant that too. Then I told him that I would not be reinstating the contracts and that he should start making calls. I hung up. I found out later, through my younger sister who had stayed carefully neutral through most of this and was one of the few people whose calls I returned, that the next 3 weeks were, by all accounts, a disaster. The venue would not transfer the contract without a complete rebooking at current rates, which were higher than what I had locked in. The caterer reduced the menu when they couldn't cover the original quote. The band they'd loved was already booked for a different event once my hold was released, and they ended up with a DJ they found on short notice. The wedding happened. I want to be honest with you about that because I've seen how these stories get told online as if the ending is always some kind of total collapse. It wasn't. They got married on a Saturday in Nashville, smaller than planned, less polished than imagined, but it happened. My parents attended. Most of the guests came. Life went on. I was not there. I had a quiet Saturday in Cincinnati. I made breakfast and walked to a coffee shop and read a book, and at some point in the afternoon, I thought, they're probably saying their vows right now. And I felt, not nothing, but something smaller and more resolved than I expected. Not grief exactly, more like the particular piece of a decision that you know, deep in your body, was correct. My relationship with my brother changed after that. I won't tell you it was repaired cleanly because it wasn't. For about 4 months, we didn't speak. Then, around the holidays, he called and we had a conversation that was halting and careful and real, in a way that many of our conversations had never been. He apologized again, this time without the urgency of needing something from me. That made it sound different. I told him I accepted the apology. I told him I also needed him to understand that something had shifted for me, not in how much I loved him, but in how I would express that love going forward. I told him I was done being the structural support, that I was his sister, not his foundation. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I think I knew that's what you become, and I think I let it happen because it was convenient." That was the most honest thing my brother had ever said to me, probably the most honest thing anyone in my family had ever said to me. I held on to it. His wife and I have not spoken much. I think we both understand that there is no version of a close relationship there, and we've settled into a polite distance that works for everyone. My parents took years to fully understand my perspective. My mother still occasionally says things that suggest she thinks I overreacted. I've stopped trying to convince her. Some people will always protect who they've always protected. I thought a lot about why I said yes to paying for that wedding in the first place. I've thought about it in therapy, in long drives, in the middle of the night when sleep doesn't come easily. I think the truest answer is that I confused love with usefulness. I thought the way to be valuable to the people I loved was to solve their problems, and in solving their problems, I made myself necessary. But necessary is not the same as loved. Being the person who writes the check is not the same as being the person who gets the seat at the table. I was 30 years old when that text came in on a Tuesday night. I am different now than I was then. Not because I'm harder or more closed off, I don't think I am, but because I understand something about myself that I didn't before. I understand that my money is not the most valuable thing I have to offer. My presence is. My attention is. The way I show up for people who have actually earned that showing up. That's the thing worth protecting. I paid $73,000 to learn that lesson. That's an expensive lesson. But I have met people who paid their entire lives for the same one and never got the receipt. I hope you don't make the same trade I did. I hope that if someone in your life is asking you to fund something, you ask clearly out loud what you are actually paying for, because the answer they give you or refuse to give you will tell you everything you need to know before you sign anything. And if your name is on the contract, remember, you always have a call to make.